Welcome to the HFY Tales channel. Remember to like and subscribe if you like the story. Enjoy and take care. Lieutenant Alex Reed had been exposed to a great number of peculiar situations throughout the course of his service with the United Earth Fleet. However, nothing had adequately prepared him for this particular situation. The message that was being displayed in front of him while he was standing on the bridge of the UEF. Prometheus caught his attention, and he turned his attention to it. The Tushal Empire, a galactic superpower that had only recently made contact with humanity, issued the decree because it was a matter of great importance. It had been issued by the government. The order for his immediate transfer to the royal palace had been issued by Queen Extala, who was the monarch who ruled over their kingdom at the time. When he was called upon, it was not for the purpose of negotiating a treaty, providing advice on military matters, or even acting as a diplomat. He was called upon for different reasons. The alien queen, on the other hand, submitted a demand that was significantly more peculiar. His voice was filled with a sense of disbelief, as Captain Torres, also known as Lieutenant Reed, stated. "The Queen of the Tushal Empire has ordered you to live with her daughter." He made a blinking motion with his eyes. "What?" He received a data pad from Torres, who gave it to him. "You've been handpicked. Apparently her daughter is difficult, and they believe a human influence might, balance her out." Reed was still reeling from everything that had happened that day, despite the absurdity of the situation. Throughout the course of the galaxy's history, humans were a relatively recent arrival. The Tushal, a race of tall, slender beings with silvery skin and eyes that resembled those of cats, had been nothing but mysterious ever since they had first come into contact with them that they had encountered for the first time. A culture that was steeped in layers of complexity that were beyond the comprehension of individuals was something that they had. In spite of this, there was this peculiar command emanating from their queen, and he found himself getting caught up in the middle of it somewhere. Reed posed the question despite the fact that he was confident in his knowledge of the response. "I have no choice in this, do I?" At that moment, Captain Torres gave a shake of the head. "Not unless you want to start an intergalactic incident. Pack your bags, Reed." At the same time that it was floating in orbit around their home planet, the Tushal Royal Palace glistened with light, as if it were made of liquid silver. When Reed entered the room, he was accompanied by Tushal guards, who were tall and imposing figures, armed with weapons that Reed could not even begin to comprehend. Immediately upon entering the grand hall, he was immediately taken aback by the lavishness that surrounded him. The ceiling gave the impression of being a depiction of the night sky. The walls were covered in intricate artwork created by extraterrestrial beings, and the sculptures were made of a substance that was crystalline in nature. He found Queen Nistala waiting for him at the opposite end of the hall, where she was sitting on a throne that appeared to float above the ground. Her features were sharp and angular, and she had silver skin and golden eyes that seemed to pierce through Reed's very being. Silver skin and golden eyes. The legends had predicted that she would be a formidable opponent, and she lived up to those expectations. "You are here because I have decided that my daughter needs interaction between humans," she said in a tone that was both authoritative and regal. Reed took a very deep breath as he was completely at a loss for what to do next. This is something that I do not understand, Your Majesty." Her response was, "You will. Princess Allura, my daughter, is someone who, exclusive. Not only does she have no interest in politics, but she also has no interest in the future of our empire. The fact that she is agitated and defiant is something that I believe you might be able to teach her, some self-control. You are going to live with her, guide her, and obey her as you would obey me," the queen said with her eyes narrowing. Reed's stomach dropped to the ground in shock. "Obey her?" As her eyes narrowed, Queen Istala leaned forward slightly. "She holds the position of the next in line, as stated by the throne. This is not a request that you, as a human being, make." Reed's heart was pounding in his chest while the queen was speaking to her guards. During that time, the queen was being signaled. They then proceeded to introduce Princess Allura to the audience a short while later. She was tall, with silver skin that shimmered in the light, and long flowing hair that was the color of deep space. Even when measured against Tishal's standards, she presented an appearance that was quite striking. Her eyes, on the other hand, were not the typical hue of gold that is associated with felines. Rather, they were a mysterious, deep violet. The wild and untamed quality in her eyes was reflected in the way that she looked at you. A smirk played around the corners of the princess's lips as she maintained her focus on Reed. Reed was the object of her attention. She asked, "So this is the human?" while her voice was a seductive purr. Reed had never before encountered anything quite like the experience of living with Princess Allura. It appeared as though she was treating him like a pet at first. She was amused by his presence and was uninterested in him. She would issue ridiculous orders to him and would anticipate that he would comply with her every whim. Reed was subjected to a variety of tests, including rearranging her room and following her into areas that no human being should ever be permitted to enter. The politics of the palace, which Allura's mother was so eager to impose on her, were not something that she was interested in. Instead, she spent her days in search of thrills, such as racing hovercraft through the skies of the city, participating in dangerous combat simulations, and sneaking out to the underbelly of the capital of Tishal in order to interact with less savory members of society. Reed struggled to keep up with the pace for the first few weeks. Every single day presented a fresh obstacle and a fresh threat. Slowly, however, something began to shift. Allura's sarcastic smiles eventually turned into genuine amusement. The sarcastic orders she gave turned into requests. She started paying attention to him, even though she didn't always take his recommendations to heart. After a particularly reckless hovercraft race that came perilously close to being a disaster, she was confronted one evening. He was so frustrated that he asked, "Why are you acting in such a manner?" He responded, "You will one day become the queen. It is not something that you are concerned about what happens to your people. Is that correct?" Despite the fact that Allura was looking out at the neon-lit city below, it was impossible to make out the expression on her face. "Human, you would not understand any of this." Reed, who was positioned with his arms crossed, reportedly said, "Try me. I did not make a request for this. There was never a time when I desired to be queen. My mother, in her eyes, I am nothing more than a tool, a weapon that can be used in her name, and nothing more than a symbol." Her violet eyes began to soften for the very first time as she cast a glance in his direction. In response, Reed moved closer to the individual in question. "Then, what is it that you desire?" The voice of Allura was barely audible, and she averted her gaze from the object of her gaze, freedom. Reed and Allura's relationship went through a period of development that transpired over the course of several weeks and months. What initially started out as a cohabitation arrangement that was imposed on them eventually evolved into something deep and meaningful. As they went along, they confided in one another and shared stories about their very different worlds. Reed provided additional information about the planet Earth, elaborating on its history, the difficulties it faces, and the goals it has for the future. Allura, in turn, revealed the secrets of the Tishal, which included the fact that her people had once been conquerors, but had grown weary of war, transforming their empire into a bureaucracy that was cold and not moving forward from its previous state. Despite the fact that she had a defiant personality, Allura still managed to be an incredible person. She possessed a strategic mind that was capable of competing with that of any military strategist. Her heart yearned for something that went beyond the throne. At some point in the middle of the night, while they were sitting on the balcony of the royal palace and watching the stars go by, Allura turned to him. "You are different from the others," she said in a soft voice. Reed showed his surprise by arching his brow. "What about others?" "The diplomats, in addition to the ambassadors, every single one of them is terrified of us. However, you are not. How come?" Before providing his response, Reed took a brief pause for a moment. "I recognize you for who you truly are. Not a queen, not an alien, just you." Allura smiled. It was a genuine smile that came from the heart, and it caught Reed off guard. "I've never encountered anyone quite like you." Following that, Neither of them communicated with one another for a considerable amount of time. However, there was something that they did not end up saying to one another that lingered in the air. As Reed and Allura grew closer to one another, they became aware of a sinister plot that was being concealed within the Tushal Empire. Queen Ixtala, despite the fact that she gave the impression of being benevolent, was not actually that kind. She had been using her daughter as a pawn in a much larger game, one that involved the subjugation of humanity and other races that were regarded as being of a lower status. Despite the fact that Allura was disgusted by the truth, she was also aware that she could not stand by and watch her mother's schemes take shape. On the other hand, she was also aware that disobeying the queen would be fraught with dangerous consequences. Because Reed was the only person she could rely on, she turned to him. "We have to put a stop to her," Allura said, exuding an air of unwavering determination in her voice. "My mother will not be allowed to destroy everything." The thoughts that were going through Reed's head were racing as he nodded. "We are going to need allies, those individuals who are more passionate about you than they are about the Queen." With a smirk, Allura smiled. "My only acquaintances are the people in question." Collectively, they began the process of assembling a small group of Loyalists, which included officials from the Tushal, soldiers, and even a few humans who had been residing within the Empire. The planning of their relocation was carried out with great care while they were working in secret. Reed was well aware that if they were unsuccessful, it would not only result in their own deaths, but it would also result in the breaking of humanity's fragile alliance with the Tushal. Reed's knowledge of this fact gave him a great deal of confidence. A state of disarray prevailed throughout the palace. Reed and Allura's forces had moved swiftly, striking at strategic locations all over the city. It is safe to say that Queen Ixtala was not defeated, despite the fact that she had been taken aback by the situation. When Reed and Allura stormed into the throne room, they found the queen holding a chilly smile on her face as she waited for them to enter. The tone of Ixtala's voice was filled with disdain as she asked, "Daughter, do you really believe that you are capable of defying me?" While Allura took a step forward, she raised her chin to a prominent position. "I have no justification for carrying out this action. This is something that I am doing for the sake of our people." Reed was able to catch a glimpse of the bewildered gaze of the queen. "What kind of a person are you? Are you serious in your belief that you have the power to change the course of events for our empire with your actions?" Due to the fact that I have faith in Allura, Reed did not flinch as he took in her gaze. The smile that Ixtala had been wearing started to fade, and for the first time, there was apprehension in her eyes. She had no time to respond before Allura raised her weapon, which was a sophisticated and cutting-edge blaster that Reed had never seen before. "Everything is over now, Mother. I would ask that you please accept my apologies for the unexpected halt, and I will provide you with the next part of the story here." In the aftermath of Queen Ixtala's downfall, the Tushal Empire found itself on the verge of entering anew. In spite of the fact that her people now acknowledge her as their legitimate ruler, Allura did not ascend to the throne as a puppet of her mother's design. Rather, she did so as a leader who had her own vision for the future. The empire, which had been complacent and governed by fear in the past, now had the opportunity to welcome change. During the ceremony that marked Allura's coronation, Reed was present by her side and watched as the once disobedient princess assumed the role of queen. Her violet eyes, which had been filled with defiance and uncertainty in the past, now glowed with determination. She had made the decision to redesign the empire, and he couldn't help but feel proud of what she had become as a result of her decision. As she addressed the crowd of Tushal dignitaries and officials, Reed whispered, "I never thought I'd see the day." He was standing just behind her at the time. A smirk continued to appear on Allura's face as she cast a fleeting glance in his direction. "You had doubts about me, human?" Reed responded with a grin on his face. "Never. However, I was uncertain as to whether or not you would be interested in this." She turned her full attention toward him while maintaining a solemn expression on her face and said, "Alex, it is not about making a desire for it. It is about conducting oneself in a dignified manner. To my people, it is intended." Reed nodded, recognizing the significance of what she had said. The connection that they had developed behind closed doors was now known to the general public, and although it did not quite meet the standards that were expected by the Tishal royal court, Allura did not appear to care about it. The mutual respect that they had for one another, as well as the peculiar equilibrium that they had discovered, would be essential in reshaping the relationship that the Empire had with humanity. This new course of action, however, did not garner the approval of all individuals within the Empire. In the shadows, remnants of Ixtala's loyalists plotted, unable to accept Allura's progressive vision for the future. The fact that Allura was associated with Reed was seen as a betrayal of their culture by these factions, which were deeply rooted in the traditional ways of doing things. They viewed humanity as a threat to their dominance. Reed discovered that he was observed on a continuous basis. It was no longer enough for him to be merely an outsider. He had become a symbol of the transformations that were taking place throughout the Empire, and not everyone appreciated that. He was ambushed in one of the palace's dark corridors one night as he was returning from a council meeting with Allura. The meeting had taken place earlier in the day. The blade was pressed against his throat just before he was able to respond to the situation. He listened attentively as a voice hissed in his ear, "You have tainted our queen, human," and then continued, "You have no business being here." For Reed, however, danger was nothing new to him. As he spun around to face the shadowy figure, he quickly elbowed his assailant and then turned around to face him. Reed barely managed to defend himself against his attacker before Allura's guards arrived. The fight that ensued was brutal and swift, and Reed was fortunate enough to survive it. The only thing that Reed was able to confirm was what he already knew, which was that there were still powerful forces within the Empire that desired for him to be removed, and that Allura's rule was not even close to being foolproof. Reed was only able to confirm this information. Following the attack, Allura increased the level of security around Reed, despite the fact that Reed objected to the change. Reed expressed his desire to avoid being treated like a helpless diplomat, but Allura refused to listen to him. Reed's objections were ignored. The words, "I will not lose you," were spoken by her with a firm voice, and her eyes shone with determination as she stated, "Since the very beginning, you have been by my side. I need you to be here." Reed was unable to argue with that, despite the fact that he is a person who is obstinate. Allura had become a significant part of his life in ways that he had not anticipated. At first, it was a forced arrangement, but it had developed into something more meaningful, such as a friendship, a partnership, and possibly even more. Reed was unable to argue with that. Nevertheless, the possibility of a civil war loomed over both of them. The old supporters of Ixtala were gathering their strength and organizing a rally against the reforms that Allura had implemented and her human advisor. They would not accept a queen who would form an alliance with a species that was of lower status. While they were deliberate over a holographic map of the Tishal capital, Reed made the statement, "We have to act," during one of the nights. "If we do not, the loyalists of your mother will tear this empire apart," the speaker said. As Allura clenched her fists tightly, her thoughts were racing out of control. After that, we proceeded to strike first. Reed fought alongside Allura, despite the fact that he was a human among the aliens, and he guided her forces with his expertise in the military. The subsequent conflict was completely different from anything else that Reed had ever experienced. The civil war in Tishal broke out in full force, with Allura's loyalists engaging in combat with the Old Guard. Reed's involvement in the conflict was unprecedented. The once beautiful halls of the palace were left scarred by blaster fire and explosions, and the palace itself became a war zone. With complete and total acceptance of her position as queen, Allura led her troops with unwavering precision and unwavering bravery. Reed's eyes had never seen her so intently focused, so resolute in her intentions to safeguard what they had constructed together. As the intense competition that was taking place, Reed was confronted by the leader of the rebellion, a powerful Tishal general who had been one of Satala's most trusted advisors. This confrontation took place in the midst of the intense competition that was taking place. Reed barely managed to hold his ground against the larger and more powerful alien during the brutal and swift fight that ensued. At precisely the moment when the general was about to deliver a blow that would prove to be fatal, Allura materialized and brought him down with her energy blade. She stood in the middle of Reed with her violet eyes blazing with a fiery intensity. She said, "I told you, you won't be lost to me." Her tone was calm but fierce as she spoke. After the rebellion was put down and the remaining loyalists of Stala were vanquished, Allura's position as queen was finally established as a secure one. The empire, which had been split up, started to recover. Although the reforms proposed by Allura were considered radical by Tushal standards, they were gradually gaining acceptance, and the alliance with humanity was becoming more stable. Reed had earned the respect of the Tushal people, despite the fact that many people still considered him to be an outsider. It was no longer possible for them to deny the connection that he and Allura shared, because he had fought for their queen and for their future. Reed had earned the respect of the Tushal people. In the course of a particular evening, Allura turned to him while they were standing together on the balcony of the palace that had been rebuilt. As she whispered, her voice was soft, and she said, "You could leave, you know. Return to being on Earth. With regard to this particular location, your obligation has been complete." Initially, Reed's gaze was directed toward the night sky, and then it was returned to her. "Would you say that you don't have any fun at all?" This resulted in Allura's violet eyes becoming more gentle as she smiled. "You are truly unique, human," the speaker said. Even though they were very different from one another, Reed took her hand, which was a gesture that conveyed a great deal of meaning. He said, "Perhaps that was exactly what we both required, something that was different." Over the course of the subsequent years, Allura's rule brought about the flourishing of the Tushal Empire. Her partnership with Reed became legendary, and it became a symbol of the alliance between two species that had previously existed on opposite sides of the galaxy because of their differences. As a result of Reed's efforts, humanity, which had previously been regarded as feeble and unimportant, had become a valued member of the intergalactic community. Even though it was an unconventional relationship, his relationship with Allura had demonstrated to the galaxy that it was possible to achieve unity even in the most improbable of circumstances. But despite everything that took place, they never left each other's side, and they were united by a common outlook on the future. When they worked together, they were confronted with new challenges, such as diplomatic crises, threats from the outside, and the ongoing challenge of balancing two very different worlds. One day, many years after the rebellion, Allura sat on her throne and looked out over the vast empire that she had helped shape. Reed was standing next to her, having become an essential component of her court. Despite the fact that their relationship had repeatedly defied all expectations, it had persisted. Reed had been a part of her court for a long time. The question was posed by Allura in a manner that was unassuming, but reflective. "I really did make the right decision, didn't I?" A look of surprise appeared on Reed's face as he asked, "What other choice is there?" It was with a grin on her face that she explained, "To bring you here in order to compel you to reside with me." "I believe either of us is aware that wasn't much of a choice for me," she said. He laughed out loud. "I believe neither of us do." The smile that Allura wore grew wider as she smiled, or perhaps it did not. Regardless, it turned out to be the best decision that I have ever made in my entire life. After making eye contact with her, Reed's eyes became warm. "This is on behalf of both of us together." It was a future that was no longer bound by the stars, but rather by the connection that they had forged against all odds. And with that, the human who had once been a reluctant guest and the alien queen who had once sought control over him found peace in their shared destiny. It was a future like no other,